life. Dive into history's hidden chapters and uncover the voices of the past. Don't forget to subscribe on YouTube Tale Trekker for more fascinating tales.
Ever get that feeling?
Yeah.
Like there's so much to know, so much history, but who's got the time to dig through it all?
Yeah, absolutely.
Well, that's what we do here. We take that deep dive. We go way back to the sources themselves today. One of the most legendary places of learning ever, the Library of Alexandria.
Wow, more than just books, right? It really was the heart of intellectual life back then.
That's it. And you gave me a great place to start, that Wikipedia article. It's amazing. So what we're going to do is we're going to pull out those fascinating bits, the things that, still make this ancient library so captivating, even today.
Totally. And while we're going to be talking about this incredible ambition, the amazing achievements, all that, it's important to remember the library didn't just appear out of nowhere. People were collecting knowledge and organizing it long before Alexandria.
So before we even get to Alexandria, what kind of libraries existed back then? Like way back?
Well, the ancient Near East, they were really into it. Think about the Sumerians. 3,400 BC, give or take. They had these early written records, really incredible. And then later on, you have these impressive royal collections, like, for example, the Library of Ashurbanipal. This was in Assyria, 7th century BC. And Babylonian kings, like Nebuchadnezzar II, they also had huge libraries.
So not just a couple of scrolls tucked away in a corner.
No. This was serious business. These were state-sponsored, preserving their history, laws, literature, the whole works, a real commitment to their culture. And this idea, it spread to Greece, too. There was even a public library way back in the 6th century BC in Athens. It was set up by Pisistratus. He was a tyrant, but he loved books, I guess.
I remember with a library card.
Yeah.
An interesting combo. So the Ptolemies, they came to power in Egypt after Alexander the Great. It sounds like they were building on something that was already, an established idea, but they took it like way further, right?
Exactly. When Alexander died in 323 BC, his empire, well, it was carved up. And Egypt ended up under the rule of the Ptolemaic dynasty. They were Macedonians. And their goal was pretty clear. They wanted to spread Hellenistic culture, that Greek influence, and learning throughout their new kingdom. And libraries, impressive libraries, were a big part of that. They were a symbol of power and a way to attract the top scholars. In fact, eventually, a lot of the major Hellenistic cities had a royal library. It was a thing.
But Alexandria, it wasn't just about being big, right?
No. The Ptolemies, they had this vision, this universal ambition. They wanted to create a repository of all knowledge. That was the goal. And, no one had ever attempted anything like that before.
Well, knowledge, that sounds, was that even possible back then? How would you even start something like that?
Well, Egypt had one big advantage: geography. The papyrus plant, the main writing material, it thrived in Egypt. It was everywhere. So they had this readily available, abundant supply of papyrus. Without that, building such a huge collection, it would have been almost impossible.
It's like they had the raw materials just waiting. So this ambition, the resources, it all comes together. How did the library actually get started? It sounds like there's some debate about who actually founded it.
Yeah, there is. The oldest account we have is this letter of Aristeas, but it was written later, maybe between 180 and 145 BC. Anyway, according to this letter, it was Ptolemy I Soter who first had the idea for the library. He ruled from, around 323 to 283 BC. And the letter also says this guy, Demetrius of Phalerum, he was a student of Aristotle. He had fled to Alexandria, and he helped to organize the whole thing, get it started.
Aristotle's student. Talk about a pedigree.
It's a great story, right? But most scholars nowadays, they think that while Ptolemy I, he was a historian himself, so he probably did have the idea. The library, the actual building and collection, it probably didn't really happen until his son, Ptolemy II, Philadelphus. He ruled from 283 to 246 BC.
So it was under Ptolemy II that the library really took shape?
Most likely. But, Demetrius, he might have still played a role. He had these connections to Aristotle's school, the Peripatetic school. So maybe he helped to acquire some of the first texts, maybe even works by Aristotle himself and Theophrastus, who was another student.
That's amazing. To think that some of the earliest works in the library might have come directly from Aristotle's circle. So we know the library was in the Bruchion, the royal quarter, but it was part of this larger institution, right? The Mausfogen. What exactly was that?
Okay, so the Mauschen, literally it means Temple of the Muses. It was a dedicated research institution. Of course, it was also a way for Egypt to, show off its wealth and power. But its main purpose was serious intellectual work, kind of like a very early university. What's really interesting is that before this, if you were an intellectual, you were usually tied to a specific philosophical school, or you had a rich patron. But the Mauschin, this was state-funded, and it was open to all sorts of thinkers. It was a totally new model for how knowledge could be, organized and advanced. And it was an idea that really wouldn't be seen again in Europe for over 1,000 years.
It's pretty mind-blowing. A temple dedicated to the arts and sciences. And this huge library, it must have been an incredible place. What did it actually look like?
Well, the exact layout is lost, but we have these little hints from the ancient sources. So imagine this. You've got these areas called bibliothecae, where the scrolls were kept, all surrounded by these impressive Greek columns. And there was a covered walkway, a peripatos, perfect for, those intellectual strolls and debates. And there was a communal dining room, reading rooms, meeting spaces, gardens, even lecture halls. It was a whole complex. And there's this famous inscription, it was apparently above the shelves. It said, "The place of the cure of the soul."
Wow. The place of the cure of the soul. That says it all, doesn't it? And I know the Ptolemaic rulers, they were very, very active in building the collection.
Oh, yeah. They were aggressive. And they had the money to do it. They sent out these royal agents. Basically, they had a blank check. Buy any written work you can find on any subject by any author. That was the mission.
That's like the dream for any book lover.
Yeah.
No budget constraints.
Pretty much. And they really wanted old copies. They believed the older, the more accurate. So they sent agents to all the big book fairs. In Rhodes, Athens, you name it. And there's even this story. It comes from Galen, the medical writer. He says that under Ptolemy II, any ship that came into the port, any books on board, they were taken to the library, copied by official scribes. And the owners, they got the copies back. But the originals, they stayed in the library.
Talk about a unexpected customs charge. I know they also focused on certain texts in particular.
Oh, yeah. Especially the Homeric epics, the Iliad and the Odyssey. Those were like the foundation of Greek education and culture, the Bible of their time. So the library, they collected tons of different versions, and they even marked them to show where they came from and if there were any interesting variations.
So it wasn't just about quantity. It was about quality and scholarship. And the Mauschin, it wasn't just a storage facility. It was a whole intellectual community.
Right. It was a community, an international group of scholars, poets, philosophers, researchers. They were all there. According to Strabo, the geographer, these guys, they got a salary, free room and board, and even tax exemption. Can you imagine? And they had a huge dining hall, lots of classrooms. So teaching was a big part of it, too. It was like a state-sponsored think tank with really good benefits.
Sounds like a pretty sweet gig.
Yeah.
And I even read somewhere that Ptolemy II, he was into zoology. So maybe there was even a zoo at the Mauschin.
It's possible. He did love animals, so who knows? Maybe they had a whole menagerie there too. But the point is, they wanted to free these brilliant minds from, everyday worries, so they could just focus on their research and intellectual pursuits. Strabo, he called this group a synodos, a community of learned individuals.
It really does sound like a golden age, all this intellectual freedom, state support. But were there any limits? Could you just, say anything you wanted?
Well, the library, it wasn't tied to one specific philosophy, and the scholars, they had a lot of freedom, but ultimately they were still under the king. And there's this story, it might be a legend, about a poet named Soteris. He wrote this poem, an epigram, that was pretty insulting towards Ptolemy II. It was about the king marrying his own sister.
Uh-oh. Family drama.
Yeah, and apparently Ptolemy II, he was not amused. He had Soteris thrown in prison and eventually executed. So freedom of thought, maybe, but freedom of speech, not so much, especially if you were criticizing the king.
Don't mess with the king. Good advice.
Yeah.
So who was actually in charge of this whole operation?
Okay, so the Mauschin, it was a religious center, remember? So it was overseen by this priest of the Muses, an epistates. He was appointed by the king. But the library itself, that was run by a head librarian, and the head librarian was also usually the tutor to the king's son. So it was a very prestigious position.
Head librarian and royal tutor. That's a pretty impressive resume. And we know the names of some of these head librarians.
We do. The first one was Xenodotus of Ephesus. His main thing was creating standardized versions of texts, like Homer and the early Greek lyric poets. What we know about his work, it mostly comes from later commentaries. They talk about what readings he preferred and the changes he made.
So he was like an editor, making sure everyone was working from the same correct version.
Exactly. And Xenodotus, he also did something really innovative. He created this glossary of rare words, and he organized it alphabetically, kind of like an early dictionary, but just for those uncommon terms. It's the earliest example we have of using alphabetical order like that. And since the library's collection, it seems to have been alphabetized by author from early on, at least by the first letter. It's possible that it was Xanadodus who set that up.
That's amazing, the beginnings of library science. And then there's Callimachus. He never became head librarian,
Yeah.
but he made this huge contribution.
Oh yeah, Callimachus. He created the Penachis. This was a massive catalog, 120 books. It listed all the authors and their works. The Penachis itself is lost. But we have these fragments and references, enough to know how it was structured. So it was divided by genre, poetry, prose. Then it was further divided within those categories, and within each section, the authors were listed alphabetically. And each entry, it had a biography of the author and a list of all their known works. It was basically the first comprehensive library catalog. Imagine the work that went into that. No computers, no databases, just, scrolls and brains.
It's mind-boggling
Yeah.
and so important. To be able to actually find what you're looking for in this vast collection. Were there other important scholars working there in those early days?
Oh, tons. Callimachus had a student, Hermippus of Smyrna. He wrote biographies. Then there was Philostephanus of Cyrene. He studied geography. And Istros, he focused on antiquities, specifically the Attica region in Greece. Alexandria was becoming the place to be if you were a scholar. And there's even a story that Archimedes, the inventor, he came up with a screw pump while he was visiting the library. I mean, can you imagine the conversations they must have had in that place?
That's incredible. The blending of all these different disciplines
Yeah.
has been amazing. So we've got Xanadodus, Callimachus, and then there's Apollonius of Rhodes.
Apollonius of Rhodes. He was actually from Alexandria and a student of Callimachus. He became the second head librarian, but he's probably better known for his epic poem, the Argonautica. He also tutored Ptolemy III. There's some thought that he might have resigned from his position. Maybe his early version of the Argonautica didn't go over well, or maybe it was just the change in leadership. Who knows?
So this incredible line of influential figures. And the scholarship, it kept expanding, moving into more scientific areas. And that brings us to Eratosthenes, right? The next head librarian.
Eratosthenes of Cyrene. He was the third head librarian. A fascinating guy. He was definitely a literary scholar, but he's most famous for his scientific work, especially in geography. He wrote this treatise, Geographica. It was groundbreaking. He was the first person to apply math to geography and map making. He even calculated the Earth's circumference, and he was incredibly accurate, using just the observations and measurements they had at the library.
Wow, they were literally measuring the world.
They were. He also created a map of the known world. He used all sorts of information from the library's collection, like accounts from Alexander's campaigns in India and these reports from Ptolemaic expeditions. They were hunting elephants in East Africa. It's amazing. Eratosthenes, he really turned geography into a science. And he was also pretty critical of traditional texts. He said that Homer's epics, they were more like stories than accurate history.
A sign of the times, maybe?
Yeah.
Like they were really pushing the boundaries of knowledge. And it wasn't just geography, right? Other sciences were being studied at the library.
Oh, definitely. There was this guy, Bacchius of Tanagra. He worked on the Hippocratic Corpus, all those medical writings. And then you have Herophilus and Erastidas. These were physicians. They made huge contributions to anatomy, although some of their work was controversial.
Because they were dissecting human bodies.
Yeah. It was a big taboo back then, but they did it. So, yeah, even in the ancient world, they had to grapple with ethical questions. And speaking of getting access to important texts, there's this famous story about Ptolemy III. He really wanted the original Greek plays from Athens.
I think I know this one. He borrowed them and then decided to just keep them.
Basically, yeah. He asked Athens for the originals, Aeschylus, Sophocles, Euripides, the big names. He offered a huge deposit as a guarantee. But then, instead of sending the originals back, he had copies made, really high-quality copies, and he sent those back to Athens. He kept the originals for the library. It was a power move. It shows how important Alexandria had become. I can only imagine the Athenians were not happy.
You could almost hear them yelling from here.
Yeah.
And as the collection grew, they ran out of space, right? That's when they built the daughter library at the Serapeum.
Yeah. Ptolemy III, his reign, that's when it happened. The main library, it was just overflowing. So they set up a second collection at the Serapeum. It was a temple dedicated to Serapis. He was a Greco-Egyptian god. It was close to the royal palace. And it became another major center for books and learning in Alexandria.
So the library just kept growing and growing. And then we come to Aristophanes of Byzantium. This is seen as like a golden age of literary criticism, right?
Yeah, Aristophanes. He became the fourth head librarian around 200 BC. He was a huge figure. The story goes that he was appointed because he was so brilliant. He caught someone plagiarizing in a poetry competition. I mean, talk about knowing your stuff. He knew the library's collection inside and out, and his time as head librarian, it really is seen as a high point for literary scholarship.
What kind of work was he doing? What made it so important?
Okay, so he was a big editor. He wanted to make poetic texts easier to read, so he started dividing poems into lines. Before that, they were often written continuously, like prose. And he also came up with the Greek diacritics, those little marks above the letters. They show you how to pronounce them, the accents, all that. He made big contributions to lexicography, which is, creating dictionaries, and to textual criticism. He developed all these signs and symbols to mark errors in the texts. Basically, he laid the foundation for how we study these works today.
It's amazing how much influence these early scholars had. And after Aristophanes, there's another figure, but maybe not as well known.
Yeah, Apollonius Idographus. He was the fifth head librarian. We don't know a lot about him. His name means classifier of forms. So some people think he was categorizing poetry based on its meter or musical forms, but we're not really sure.
And what about medicine? Was that still being studied?
Oh, yeah. They had scholars like Zeuxis the empiricist. He wrote commentaries on the Hippocratic corpus, and he was always looking for new medical writings to add to the collection. And then there was Ptolemy Epithes. He even wrote about the wounds described in Homer's epics. So they were connecting literature and medicine. Really interesting stuff.
So this interdisciplinary approach was still going strong, but then things start to change politically. And of course, that affects the library.
It does. The early 2nd century BC, that's when Ptolemaic power starts to decline. There was this big battle, the Battle of Raphia. It was in 217 BC. After that, the kingdom, it was unstable. There was unrest, disruptions in Upper Egypt. And the rulers, they started to emphasize the Egyptian side of their identity, more than the Greek. So maybe their priorities changed. And a lot of Greek scholars, they started to leave Alexandria, looking for, more stable places to work, a kind of brain drain.
The library was losing its star players. And then we get to Aristarchus of Samothrace, the sixth head librarian. Some people say he was the greatest scholar in antiquity.
Aristarchus, he was a giant. He produced these
Whispers
editions
of the
classic
past
works, poetry,
in every
prose, and he added these
page.
extensive commentaries. They were called hypomnemata.
Stories
Think of them
lost
like
but
super
now
detailed analyses, like
engaged.
footnotes, but times
From
1,000. He would
ancient
explain
lands
passages, define
to
words,
empire's
even question if certain
might,
lines were authentic.
we
He was an
journey
expert on
through
Homer.
the
Everyone respected his
fading
judgment.
light.
We even have a fragment of his commentary
Unlock
on
the
Herodotus.
mysteries,
Sounds incredibly
tales
But his time as head
untold.
librarian,
The
he'd coincide
forgotten
with
pages,
really bad
history
luck.
unfolds
Sadly, yes,
with
this is
every
145 BC, this dynastic
episode.
struggle.
A
And
new
Aristarchus,
quest.
he was independence.
Delving deep, we seek the rest.
rest.
Echoes of kings and queens arise. Battles, triumphs, and demise. Chronicles etched in time's own hand, revealing secrets of the land. Unlock the mysteries, tales untold.
For example, you have Dionysius Thrax. He was a student of Aristarchus. He set up a school on Rhodes. And Apollodorus of Athens, another student, he went to Pergamum. That was Alexandria's big rival. He taught and did research there. It was such a dispersal of knowledge, someone even said, sarcastically, that Alexandria had become the teacher of all Greeks and non-Greeks.
So the library's influence was spreading, in a way. But the library itself, it was starting a long decline.
Right. Back in Alexandria, the later Ptolemies, they had other problems. Unrest, money troubles. The library and the Mautian, they weren't as important to them. And the status of the head librarian, it went way down. It even became like a political favor. Ptolemy VIII, he actually appointed one of his palace guards as head librarian. Can you imagine? And after that, it just got worse. The position was so unimportant, writers stopped even bothering to record who held it.
Sad. From Xanodotus and Aristarchus to a palace guard. And it wasn't just the library. Scholarship itself, it changed during this period.
It did. By the 1st century BC, things were different. All the big classic texts, they were standardized. People had already written tons of commentaries on them, so there weren't as many opportunities to, discover something new. A lot of scholars, they started just compiling and reworking old commentaries instead of coming up with their own ideas. Some of them, they started working on more recent authors.
So less focus on those foundational texts, more on interpreting and summarizing existing knowledge. And this is when the library suffers a major blow. The Siege of Alexandria by Julius Caesar.
Yeah, 48 BC, Caesar's civil war. He was trapped in Alexandria. His forces, they set fire to some Egyptian ships, and the fire, it spread. It caused a lot of damage in the city. Seneca the Younger, he quotes this historian, Livy, and he says that about 40,000 scrolls from the library were destroyed. Plutarch, he also writes about it. He says the Great Library was burned.
40,000 scrolls. That's heartbreaking. Was the library completely destroyed?
Well, we don't know for sure. There's this historian, Cassius Dio, he writes about it too. And some people think what he's saying is that the fire, it only destroyed a warehouse. It was near the docks, and they were storing scrolls there temporarily, so maybe the main library building was okay. But whatever happened, the library, it wasn't completely destroyed. The geographer Strabo, he writes about visiting the Mausoleum around 20 BC, so decades after the fire, which means it was still there. It either survived or they rebuilt it. But the way he writes about it, it doesn't sound like the same prestigious place it once was. And he doesn't even mention the library separately, so maybe it was just a shadow of its former self.
So, still there, but maybe not the same. And wasn't there that story about Mark Antony? He supposedly gave Cleopatra a huge number of scrolls from the Library of Pergamum.
Yeah, Plutarch tells that story. He says Mark Antony gave Cleopatra 200,000 scrolls. It was right before the Battle of Actium. That was in 33 BC. Plutarch himself says that his source, a guy named Callisthenes, well, maybe he wasn't totally reliable. It could have been propaganda. But some historians argue that the story wouldn't make any sense if the Library of Alexandria wasn't still around to receive those scrolls. And maybe Antony gave them to Cleopatra to make up for the damage caused by Caesar's fire. That's another theory.
An act of library love. And later on, there's this scholar, Didymus Chalcynteris. He worked in Alexandria at the end of the 1st century BC, beginning of the 1st century AD. And his work, it suggests that there were still significant resources available to scholars.
Didymus Chalcynteris, he was insanely prolific. He wrote something like 3,500 to 4,000 books. That's a lot of writing. And it shows he had access to a ton of texts. His main thing was compiling and summarizing the commentaries of earlier scholars. So he was really drawing on that legacy, all that knowledge from the library's golden age.
So the library was still functioning, in some capacity at least, even under Roman rule. But the golden age was definitely over.
Yeah. We don't know a lot about the library during the Roman Principate. We know that the Emperor Claudius, he added to the collection, but basically what happened to the library, it mirrored what happened to Alexandria itself. It declined under Roman rule. And membership in the Mausoleum, it changed too. It used to be based on, scholarly achievement, but then it became more about, achievements in government or the military. Even athletes could become members. And the position of head librarian, it lost all its prestige.
Not the same intellectual powerhouse anymore. And there were other libraries starting up in Alexandria, right?
Yeah. While the Great Library was fading, other libraries were popping up, like the Caesareum and the Claudianum and the Serapeum, the daughter library. It probably kept growing too. Some people even think that scrolls from the Great Library ended up in these newer collections.
So Alexandria's intellectual life was changing, becoming more decentralized. And even the word Alexandrian, it took on a different meaning.
Yeah. By the 2nd century AD, Alexandrian started to mean something else. It was about meticulous editing, fixing tiny errors, writing commentaries that were based on older works, basically refinement rather than originality. It started to be associated with pentree.
Not exactly the legacy you'd want for such a legendary institution. And then eventually, we just stop hearing about the Great Library and the Mausoleum. They disappear from the historical record.
Yeah. After the mid-3rd century AD, they're gone. The last mentions of people calling themselves members of the Mausoleum, that's from the 260s AD. After that, nothing.
And then the final blows during the Roman conflicts in Alexandria.
Yeah. In 272 AD, Aurelian, the Roman emperor, he recaptured Alexandria. It had been taken by the Palmyrene Empire. And during the fighting, the Brocian, that's where the main library was, it was probably destroyed. So if the library and the Mausoleum were still around, this was probably the end for them. And then a few years later, in 297 AD, Diocletian, another Roman emperor, he besieged Alexandria. More damage. The Brocian was hit again.
So a series of unfortunate events, and probably the end of the original library. But then there are those stories about the Arabs destroying the library in the 7th century.
Yeah, 642 AD. The Arab army conquered Alexandria, and later Arabic sources say that Caliph Umar, he ordered the destruction of the library. And there's that famous quote, if the books agree with the Quran, they're unnecessary, and if they disagree, they should be destroyed. And the stories say they used all the books to fuel the bathhouses in the city for 6 months.
A dramatic story. But it sounds like modern historians are not so sure about it.
They're skeptical. I mean, these stories, they were written centuries after the event. And the writers, they had their own agendas. Plus, the librarian Mawson, they were probably already gone by the 7th century. And there's another thing, a similar quote about destroying books that disagree with the Quran. It shows up in stories about the Arab conquest of Persia. So maybe it's just a legend. Maybe it was invented to explain why all these ancient libraries disappeared.
So the idea that the Arabs burned down the library, it's probably not true. It was a much longer, more complicated process.
Exactly. But even though the main library was gone, Alexandria's intellectual life, it didn't completely disappear. Other institutions emerged. They were like successors to the Mawson.
Like the Serapeum, the daughter library.
Yeah, the Serapeum. By the late 4th century AD, it was probably the biggest collection of books left in Alexandria. It was still a major pilgrimage site for pagans, and it was a center for Neoplatonist philosophers. But then in 391 AD, it was destroyed. Bishop Theophilus, he was a Christian, he ordered it to be vandalized and demolished. We don't know for sure if there was still a big library there at that point.
So the physical collections, they were disappearing. But what about that spirit of the Mawson, that community of scholars?
Well, there are some references to a Mawson in a different location in Alexandria. This is in the 4th and 5th centuries AD. But we don't know much about it. It was probably smaller than the original. And then there was the school of Theon and Hypatia. They called it a Mawson too, but it was more of a symbolic connection. It was a Neoplatonist school, pretty conservative.
And Hypatia, she's a fascinating figure. Her story's really connected to the end of this era in Alexandria.
Hypatia, yeah. Theon's daughter, she took over the school when he died, and she became really influential, even in politics. But she got caught up in this feud. It was political and religious. And in 415 AD, she was murdered by a Christian mob. It was a terrible end. And it's often seen as marking the end of her particular school of thought. Although it's worth noting that paganism and Neoplatonism, they continued in Alexandria for a while.
So intellectual life, it carried on. Even without the Mawson, there were new lecture halls being built. And there are even references to a physical Mawson after Hypatia's death.
Yeah, people are still thinking, still discussing, still teaching. But it wasn't the same as the old Mawson, not on that scale. And it didn't have that same level of state support.
Let's talk about the library's collection itself. It was mostly papyrus scrolls, right? And ironically, the library was indirectly responsible for the creation of parchment.
It's true. Egypt, under the Ptolemies, they didn't want Pergamum to have too many books. Pergamum was their rival, so they restricted the export of papyrus. And Pergamum, they had to find another way, so they developed parchment. It's made from animal skins, and it worked pretty well. As for the size of the library's collection, Ptolemy II, he supposedly wanted 500,000 scrolls. That was the goal. We don't know the exact number they had at its peak. The Pinakes, Callimachus's catalog, it's not complete. But the estimates, they range from 40,000 scrolls to 400,000 scrolls. That's a lot of papyrus.
A lot of papyrus and a lot of knowledge. So the Library of Alexandria, it was more than just a building. It was the symbol of, intellectual ambition. It was this incredible center of scholarship. And it brought together some of the brightest minds of the ancient world. It's sad that it disappeared. And the way it disappeared, it's still a bit of a mystery, but its impact, it's undeniable.
It is. The Library of Alexandria, it was this groundbreaking research institution. It made huge contributions to math, astronomy, physics, and especially to textual criticism. It gave us standardized versions of these incredibly important texts. Of course, it wasn't the only ancient library, but it was the most famous, the most prestigious. And its influence, it was huge. It can be seen in later institutions like the Imperial Library of Constantinople and the House of Wisdom in Baghdad, maybe even in the development of European universities. And then there were these early Christian libraries. They were modeled on Alexandria. They even used the same philological techniques, the methods of textual analysis. They used them on Christian scriptures.
It's funny, isn't it? The fact that we still have so many ancient texts, it's not really because of these grand libraries. It's because of all those scribes, all those monks who copied and recopied these works over centuries.
It's true. Their dedication, their hard work, that's what saved these texts. And of course, the spirit of the Library of Alexandria, it lives on in the modern Bibliotheca Alexandrina.
Yeah, UNESCO, they built it. It was finished in 2002. It's a library, a cultural center. They even have an international school of information science there. It's a great way to honor that legacy of learning.
It really makes you think, about all those lost scrolls, what secrets they held. If we could just find one of them, imagine what we could learn.
What a find that would be. What do you think? If you could choose one discovery from the Library of Alexandria, what would have the biggest impact on how we understand the past?
Wow, that's a tough one. I mean, maybe a complete version of a lost philosophical work, something that would completely change how we think about ancient philosophy. Or, how about this? Detailed astronomical observations. That would be amazing. It would give us a whole new perspective on how people in that time saw the cosmos. So many possibilities.